Hello. Well, thank you all for having me. I think this is a pleasure. I'm really proud of what Hood College is doing here, and a big shout outs to the Cottons for making this happen as well. I think it's a great opportunity, and I think it's a great idea to really start bringing the cybersecurity topic into conversation. Hopefully, we could bring it more into academia, and generates or creates the next generation of cybersecurity professionals. Because one thing we're definitely going to talk about today is the lack of talent and skills that we have in this country. We kind of need to work on that together. But just a quick intro here. My name is Hector Monsegur. Like the awesome president has said right now, I'm director of assessments for a penetration testing boutique out of Seattle, Washington. And what that really means, all day, every day, I'm doing offensive work. I'm doing penetration testing, red team, or what some in the industry call adversary simulation. And you notice a lot of these terms are military, because a lot of the folks that created kind of the security industry today were military folks. So you're going to hear terms like blue teams, red teams, purple teams, and I'll kind of explain that as we go forward here. But I guess the point here is that I've done nothing but offensive research or offensive engagements over the last 20 odd years, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to have this conversation. Especially knowing that your previous two speakers were on the defense side of things. We had General Keith Alexander, who did an amazing job, I heard, and then we had another individual that spoke about policies, especially from the NIST side of things. And so I'm really proud to be here. So, quick intro. So I started off as just a kid from the projects, from the hood. My family members were drug dealers. Trying to get that out the way quickly, because it kind of led to where I'm at today. There was a point where my entire family went to prison, and I would have to say, we were a small tribe. My father, my aunt, and my grandmother. They were all arrested, part of a massive drug conspiracy, and it kind of left me in a position where I needed to figure out my life. Am I going to follow in my father's footsteps and become another statistic, or am I going to deviate and become something different? And my goal, and I assure you all, is that my goal was to be the good guy. Okay, it kind of changed along the way. Now, there's a flip side to my story. Aside from me being a professional now in the industry, at one point I was the bad guy. I used to use the name Sabu instead of Hector. I was part of Anonymous. I was part of LawSec. I was one of the co-founders of LawSec. And for those of you that don't know what these organizations were, what we did on a day in and day out was expose security weaknesses across the internet, from federal contractors, whose names I don't want to mention, to militaries and governments around the world. Some of the notable things that we did was shutting down the Tunisian government's infrastructure during the uprising or the Arab Spring, attacking Syria, extracting 80 gigabytes or whatever it was of emails from the Syrian government, and then leaking it online, eventually leading to WikiLeaks. And mind you, some of that stuff I'm not proud of, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you examples here. And my forewarning, or disclaimer rather, is that I'm not here to glorify any of that. Definitely not. I learned my lessons, and I'm hoping they're takeaways. Because what made me successful as a black hat are some of the things that are going to make you successful as security professionals, or at least having awareness that's going to help you secure your home network, or maybe your pop and shop organization, or pass on to folks that are into the industry. So as I said before, I started off very young. I started watching films like Wargames, Hackers, Sneakers. I know I mentioned it previously with the class before, but some of these films gave me some interest, inspiration, especially when I was online by myself, 12 years old, back in 1995. And I wanted to know what a hacker was. And it's very hard to determine what a hacker is when you watch a film like Wargames, because you see that our antagonist or protagonist is war dialing, basically calling up a bunch of phone systems, and this is back supposedly in the 80s, right? Calling a bunch of phone systems via his modem, attempting to access the computer systems on the other side, looking for games. And unfortunately, he ran into NORAD. He had access to the Whopper system. And then he accidentally, started a war game simulation, which the folks thought were real, created a big drama. Now, by the time I got online, again, in the mid-90s, war dialing was still a thing, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. I kind of wanted to learn how to break applications, and I've realized since then. And I'm not an artist, I'm not a mechanic, I'm not a carpenter. I'm just really good at breaking applications for whatever reason. And so it kind of fit to stick with this career path. Now, very similar to what I said again to the earlier class, the process of learning how to hack, right, it was trying to understand what made an application tick. So I started by looking at web applications. And some of you may know when you go to a website now, you may see .php or .asp, .jsp. Those are extensions. Those are usually small applications that are dynamically generated, or rather they're coded to generate dynamic pages on the load. And some of those languages have been around for quite some time. But when I started on the internet, when I was really online looking at applications, most of them were written in something called CGI, Common Gateway Interface. And most of those were programmed in usually two different languages, C, which to me is still crazy that anyone had deployed C binaries as a web application, but also Perl. And in a way, Perl became my first love, because then the process was, if I want to break an application, get into a server, I would need to load the language that the application is written in. So now I had to learn Perl. Mind you, I was a teenager, I was young, my English was still bad. I had just come from Puerto Rico in the early 90s. So it was just a matter of learning from scratch. It seemed foreign to me, absolutely, I guarantee you that. But eventually, it kind of made sense. I had a good understanding of the syntaxes and the nuances of the language, to the point that I could create an application, a small Perl script that I could inject a command into, through the command arguments. And then I applied that to web applications that were running Perl scripts on their web servers. And now you reach a point where, okay, now we can break a web application, we could execute commands on the web servers, but you also have to know how to operate the underlying file system. You have to learn how to utilize the underlying operating system. In those days, the operating systems were mostly UNIX, Solaris, SunOS, FreeBSD, any of the Unixes, some Linux, and Windows really wasn't the player, at least at that time, for most web servers. So it was a matter of learning Perl, learning Unix, and eventually, almost by accident, I became a systems administrator, just by reading documentation and learning to hack by hacking to learn. It's a great quote by a friend of mine, Brute Logic on Twitter, who, he loves that quote, and I always try to use that quote because it makes the most sense here. Now, there's one thing I want to point out, that when I began learning how to hack, it was more of a way of kind of escaping from my reality. I needed to get away from the situation at home. I had no family members. I was living with extended family at the time, and I kind of needed to escape from that reality of how tough the situation was. But eventually what ends up happening is that, I start to learn about lateral movement, right? Another military phrase for you. When you're trying to move laterally across an environment, okay, so I've compromised a web application, I compromised the underlying operating system, but what can you do beyond that? And mind you, just a quick note here, I wasn't a carder, I wasn't a scammer, I wasn't looking for credit cards or anything like that. I would say that my hacking at that time, at least, was very innocent in nature. One thing you learn from reading old hacker texts or documentation or old e-zines, what they used to call them, a lot of the stuff was knowledge is power and education is key. We didn't have CTFs or capture the flags in those days. We didn't have virtualized environments like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, or even Alibaba. It was, you pretty much had to break into systems, or you had to have a lot of money for a Unix license, a lot of money for a server, and then access to a co-location at a data center so you can actually test and learn off your own systems. Now, moving forward, as you can imagine, I went from a newbie to a rather neophyte to an intermediate, and then I started moving forward to the point where I consider myself a gray hat. And a gray hat, and just a quick background here. So you have a black hat, who are usually the bad guys, the adversaries, aside from the nation-state actors and so on. Then you have the gray hats, who are kind of like what I'm describing for you. Then you have the white hats, who are supposedly the professionals in the industry. But they dipped and dabbed a little bit back in the days, I'm sure. So moving forward, I began doing more focused attacks. well, I could break into this random web server in Japan. Can I break into, let's say, a foreign government? And again, this was very innocent, at least at that time. And one of the first environments that I broke into was indeed a foreign government for a small nation in Asia. And my lessons there were lateral movements, having a methodology, having a structure, and then learning how to move very quickly and exfiltrate information very quickly. Which leads me to the point of what made, I mean, there's a whole bunch of hackers in the world. There's been hackers for the last 20 years. Black hats, gray hats, white hats. So like, why is Hector here? Why was he successful for at least that time? And what I learned early on is having a methodology, and this applies to those getting into the cybersecurity industry. Having a methodology changed my entire perspective when it came down to compromising and lateral movement and so on. And the methodology could be as simple as creating a checklist of things that you want to do first, all the way to the end, maybe have a goal towards the end. A quick example would be first step would be reconnaissance and information gathering, DNS enumeration, looking at certificate data, trying to find host names for a target. The second thing would be to, the OS ints, finding information about systems administrators, network administrators, and anyone that has access to your target. The third would be, well, what is that the target has? What do they have? Intellectual property, emails. What are the goals? The fourth would be compromise. During the reconnaissance phase, you're going to be scanning systems and services, identifying vulnerable entry points, or entry points that are theoretically vulnerable. You could try to exploit along the way. And then, of course, you get to the point where it's time to exploit. Now, the exploiting phase was very different back then to how it is now. So back in the mid-90s, early 2000s, mid-2000s, a lot of folks were releasing exploit kits or exploits that you could compile. That's where the phrase or term of zero-day became really popular, because there were a lot of zero-day exploits that were unreleased, unknown. They were being used by hackers all around the world, and he had zero idea. And I'm going to give you some good examples here. If you guys are really big into history or hacker history now, you have things like, well, what happened with the Morris worm back in '88, where you had a worm that spread across the internet, attacking the SMTP servers or the printer daemons. Even though the vulnerability was known, a lot of networks would not patch those systems. And we're going to get to asset management towards the end of this, because I think it's really important to know this stuff. And then you move later on, and you start to see that during, I believe it was 2000 or 2001, we had an incident with China. I'm not sure if you guys remember that. Some of you do, where we had a spy plane crash into the South China Islands, and the Chinese government would not release the plane back to us. It became an international affair, became a very serious issue, because now it was a political one. It was very public, and I believe the Chinese government just wanted an apology, which Clinton did not want to do for some reason. I get it. But what ends up happening is we get to see the power of the Chinese hacker community. Because for a very long time, you heard that you had Russian hackers, you had Chinese hackers. Chinese organizations would say, they would flaunt rather, that they had the biggest hacker organization in the planet. The Chinese Hacker Union, or the HUC, were boasting that they had 60,000 hackers at their disposal at any moment. So of course you're thinking, well, China is huge, is large, they probably do have that many security researchers, but you did not get to see their force until that incident. And the reason why I'm going to give you this example is because this is what led directly to me getting into hacktivism. Okay? So the incident with China became interesting because the first thing they did, once there was like a little cyber declaration of war, as cheesy as that sounds, you had literally thousands of US government servers getting compromised all across the internet, whether they had websites with .govs in their URLs or they didn't. Machines were compromised through vulnerable, it's a repeat of history, vulnerable printer daemons, LPDs, similar to the Morris worm in '88. And this incident, by the way, was in 2000, 2001. Vulnerable printer daemons, and the Chinese worm, which was called Lyon Worm, with a 1 instead of an I. Please look this up. It's really cool hacker history, security history. Lyon Worm spread across Linux machines all across the internet overnight, and they would deface every web server with a message. HUC, the Chinese Hacker Union, was here. the United States needs to apologize, and so on. So what ends up happening is you kind of have like the U.S. Sino first cyber war, the first conflict. And I was recruited, because at the time I was part of the hacker groups, I was mingling with folks. I was recruited, out of all people, by a Canadian. And the Canadian's name was Pantera. He said, we gotta hit the Chinese hackers back, man. So, it's kind of interesting that we had a Canadian that was patriotic for the U.S. cause. The first thing that we did was we formed an organization called Hackwiser, another hacker history thing for you guys to look up, and we began compromising large amounts of Chinese infrastructure overnight. My specialty at that time, for whatever reason, don't ask me, was DNS vulnerabilities. I had taken over, just to give you a breakdown of what DNS is, just imagine like a yellow pages or a white book, or white pages, and inside you have a reference to a company or a person, and if you want their phone number, you just look them up in the book, and voila, you have their phone number. DNS operates very similar to on the internet, where you have DNS servers all around the internet caching responses, and then you have 11 to 50 main internet DNS servers that are part or make up part of the internet's general infrastructure. And those will serve DNS records for their respective countries, or AppNIC, or any of their organizations that run DNS for specific continents. Now, with that being said, my focus was extracting information from DNS servers at the time. At the time, there was a vulnerability or a feature, right, called AXFR that would let you extract entire DNS records for domains. And then I would take that and just enumerate or scan or audit every single machine I would find. Then you also had another set of vulnerabilities against binds, which is software, very popular software for DNS infrastructure, where there was at least two separate remote command execution attacks. And believe it or not, even though most of the planet had patched their DNS servers, some of the old school infrastructure DNS servers that have been around for 10 years were still vulnerable. I compromised those. I got access to millions of DNS records, and I was able to sniff DNS traffic for quite some time. Again, I'm not glorifying any of this, but it goes to show you that methodology and a lack of scope really takes hackers a long way. And we'll talk about scopes in a minute. So now we have a little cyber war between the US and Chinese hackers in Canada, apparently. And it lasted several weeks. It was interesting because we got to see the methodology employed by the Chinese hackers. They already had done the reconnaissance probably months or years before. They had a good understanding of DNS enumeration. They were hitting US government sites that were kind of, hard to find on Google. And you have to remember, Google at the time was still very young. You had AltaVista or xsite.com, which were very basic search engines. So the fact that they found these servers meant they were either doing, scanning IP ranges all day, every day, looking for changes in services, maybe new web servers that were added along the way, and then looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit on the fly. That incident opened my eyes. Hacktivism is a thing. And it just so happens that in the year 2000, the Cult of Dead Cow, which is an old hacker group from back in the days, in fact, one of our politicians now, Beto O'Rourke, apparently was a member of Cult of Dead Cow. So that's really cool if you're into hacker history. And so the process there, or now the interest is there. And I'm like, okay, so hacktivism seems like a real thing. CDC had just coined the term. Before CDC, you had political hacking operations, but there was never really a name for it. It was just hacking, right? Or defacements. So now I'm a hacktivist. Now I'm compromising what I thought, doing the right thing. I thought I was doing the right thing, rather. I was compromising systems, mostly government systems, whenever there was like a political issue in the news. And for whatever reason, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought that, it was the right way to go. It was, again, my escape. I wasn't really thinking clearly. And, of course, I was a teenager, so it doesn't really help. My consequential thinking wasn't really there, I'll be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen. But I began with the cyber war. I have to use quotes because this is funny terminology. The cyber war between India and Pakistan. I had participated in that. Don't ask me why, because I'm not Indian or Pakistani. But I did participate in that, and the first thing I did was compromise systems on both sides. I was a mercenary of sorts, if you want to call it that. And then we had an issue with Indonesia and Malaysia Now, it just so happens that I had hacker friends, right, that were Malaysian, and the Indonesians were very talented folks, even to the day. In 2019, Indonesia is a tech hub, for those of you that didn't know. And so it just so happens that my DNS knowledge, my knowledge of DNS infrastructure played an interesting role in that little conflict, because I was able to move laterally from a university that controlled Indonesian internet. I took over NS1 and NS2.ID, which were the central DNS servers for Indonesia. And for about a week, I had full control of all DNS for the Indonesian government, to the point that I even broke into their computer emergency response team, the CERTs. Again, not glorifying any of this, but it goes to show you that the lateral movement and having an understanding of, you know, the external security posture of an organization, doing that reconnaissance and information gathering is really important. And for you folks that are starting your careers in cybersecurity, the methodology that I'm proposing, as simple as it is, because you could actually work on it and improve upon it, is going to help you on the defense side as well. That's why organizations tend to hire folks like me to do adversary simulations, and kind of work with their blue teams to understand what it is that we're seeing, what it is that we can exploit, what are the core issues, what are some of the gray areas, or some of the areas that they just completely missed, right? Where there's asset management, and asset management is as simple as having an inventory of every system, every device on your network, having an understanding of what those systems are running, what their purposes are, what kind of information they're storing, whether it's intellectual property, emails, or as a development environment, and then being on top of those systems. Having a list of those systems really doesn't mean anything if you're not patching them. And a good example of that is the Equifax situation. You know, not to you know, put any negativity their way, but they understood that they had an old Apache setup. They understood that it was vulnerable, and then of course, because of policy or whatever, they did not patch that set of systems in time. And that's a very good lesson. Now, as I move forward into hacktivism, there was a point where I kind of got bored with it, to be honest with you, and I wanted to change my life. See, I didn't go into hacking, or I didn't go into this field to just be a criminal. That wasn't my intent. I wanted to kind of create a career, take care of my family. My grandmother was old by this time. She was sick, so I had to take care of her. And there was no money coming in. All my family were gone. They were all locked up in prison. And so it was just me as a teenager trying to figure out ways to make money, doing internships, and eventually becoming a systems administrator based off of the experience I learned as a black hat. And that was kind of weird. That was a kind of funny situation, because I walk into a job, I'm 18 years old, I have no certifications, I barely have a GED, and I'm like, hey, so I can run all your Linux systems if you want. I've been doing it for 10 years. So moving forward, I left hacktivism, I left all that alone, right? When I was a child, I played with childish things, and when I became a man, I had to let them go, right? Ozzy Osbourne quote, even though I butchered it. So I left it alone. I kind of left it alone, and it was time to become a professional in the field, and I did. I started off by becoming a systems administrator, mostly working with FreeBSD servers. I think my first job I had 14 FreeBSD servers per shift by myself. Had to make sure all the machines were running fine. Had to watch Nagios, which is kind of like a monitoring system. And if there was an alert on my phone, I would hop on my Sidekick. You guys remember that, T-Mobile Sidekicks? They had an SSH client. And so the SSH client worked really well on those T-Mobile Sidekicks. I would just get on if I was in the bathroom or if I was outside, and I would just administer servers from there, and the job was as easy as possible. But then history repeats itself. Common trend, I think a lot of us noticed that. My grandmother passes away, and that really put me for a whirlwind. She passes away in the worst possible way. The timing was really horrible. I became a foster parent at the same time. So I'm a single guy now with 2 little girls. I'm trying to raise them. And even though life is good, I have a good job and things are going fine, I really lost it emotionally. And I think most of us would in the same situation. When you have no support, no family, and it's just you and 2 kids, and it's your first time raising girls, and girls, by the way, are just, they're hardcore, man. After I would be done with their homework, I would help them with their homework and put them to bed. I would turn on the computer, and guess who was back? Sabu was back, even though I had retired for a very, very long time. And what did I come back to? I came back to WikiLeaks being formed, Anonymous being formed. I came back to hacktivism being reborn, coming back to brand new communities of hackers around the world that were way more sophisticated than I remember. We had groups in Romania, Croatia, Slovenia that were awesome. You had groups in Russia that were killing it, groups in Ukraine that were amazing. Brazil and Argentina, all of South America, there's hackers everywhere now. And there are a lot of really talented folks. And unfortunately, for most of you in here, a lot of them are desperate for money. So eventually, they're either going to turn into scammers, or they're going to turn into, breaking into systems for databases, credit card databases, passwords. And I kind of want to go into that in a minute, because I think that's part of what I really wanted to talk about today, which is the skill and talent shortage we have in this country, and some of the ideas I have that we could probably move that forward on, or some ideas we could move forward on. So that's what I came back to. I came back to this chaotic mess on the internet, and it kind of aligned with where I was mentally, to be honest with you. Not the best reason or excuse to come back. The first thing I did, this was during the whole WikiLeaks thing, situation. The first thing I did was information gathering and reconnaissance against the Swedish government, specific to the courts. And then my goal was to extract documentation about Julian Assange's, impending court cases. The next step was to compromise elements of the financial industry, PayPal, MasterCard, and Visa, for the purpose of shutting them down as a protest for them banning or blocking WikiLeaks. Again, I feel really dumb now, because I was fighting someone else's battle. That wasn't my story. That wasn't my situation. And then the Arab Spring happens. And the Arab Spring brought me back to 2000, 2001, where you had, and correct me if I'm wrong, the first revolution that happened on the internet. Tunisia did that. And naturally, because of the position I was in, I wanted to participate in that. What can I do to help the Tunisians? Well, the first thing was, again, methodology, information and reconnaissance against the Tunisian military, Tunisian infrastructure, DNS servers, mail servers. What kind of infrastructure do they have in place? And once I was done with my report, I had a list of about 8 different IP addresses that were essential to day-to-day Tunisian government operations. One was one central mail server. 2 was 2 DNS servers that were central to Tunisian government's DNS day-to-day operations. Then the other 5 servers were machines that led to their computer emergency response teams, 1 that led to their intelligence agency, and a couple other law enforcement agencies. The point there was to, and I hate to say it this way, but the point was to shut down the Tunisian government during the height of the uprising. So there was a point where, post self-immolation of the protester over there in Tunisia, post the people in the crowds, but there was a point that I identified where Tunisian police officers were driving their trucks into crowds. You guys remember that? Remember that? That was a really crazy, weird situation, and that's what sparked that revolution as hard as it did. And as soon as I saw that on the news, I began by compromising their prime minister's network, a couple websites. There wasn't anything sensitive there. The next step was to compromise their mail server to extract documentation or documents. That didn't lead to anything interesting. I guess their documents were hosted internally. And then the next step was to shut down their DNS and bring them offline. And that also involved bringing down their telecoms, cell phone providers, and anything that was related to Tunisian government's infrastructure. And it worked. It happened. What I did caused a stir. People talked about it online. It was a really crazy time for me. And I remember after my long nights of compromising systems, especially that first night, I literally, I closed the lid to my laptop and I just threw it away. I got rid of it. Until I realized that the government wasn't going to arrest me for that, because hacking foreign governments technically is illegal. At least so I thought. Came back a week or 2 later, and I started compromising elements of the Egyptian government, focusing on their military, focusing on their police. Same with Libya, same with Syria. With Syria, we extracted, 80 gigabytes or 100 gigabytes worth of emails from their government. Some of them, or most of them, ended up on WikiLeaks. We began infiltrating Iran. We began infiltrating certain parts of, regions and areas and countries that, were not friendly to the U.S. But then, of course, I made the mortal mistake of passing or bringing that attention inward. And I crossed the line when I began to infiltrate, compromise, and exfiltrate information from U.S. federal contractors, the U.S. government, the United States Senate, and eventually the FBI Academy and InfraGard. And that's when I knew I was at the point of no return, and I knew that the FBI was coming, and that's exactly what happened. As soon as I hit InfraGard, I started compromising accounts for the FBI Academy. I had to knock on the door and had to face reality. That what I was doing was not, I wasn't Che Guevara, right? I wasn't an internet revolutionary. I was just a criminal at that point. So even though I started off very innocently, and I started off with a curiosity for knowledge, I ended up being radicalized. Whether it was self-radicalization or radicalized by the people that were surrounding me, in Anonymous or whatever. And it was a serious reality check when I was in a federal maximum facility, hanging around with a bunch of cartel members, them telling me their stories of how they flew 1,000 kilograms of cocaine into the country. And you start to realize, damn, I'm literally in here for computer hacking. Like, that is, trust me, I laughed to myself in my cell. It was a reality check, and then I also realized, after a lot of self-reflection, that those battles that I participated in, those weren't my battles. Those weren't my beefs. I could have taken my skills and experience and created a very good career out of it. I could have, been a model citizen. I could have done so many different things. I could have, just helped in a different way. And so I'm hoping that once some of the young folks hear my story, you're not going to be motivated by any of the bad stuff. Be motivated by the reality that, yeah, I learned a lot, I came a long way, but that path is definitely not worth it. Now, moving forward, 2019. Some of the things that I was abusing back in the days, back when I was a full-blown black hat or hacktivist or however you want to call it, some of the things that I've used to exploit back in those days are still very prevalent today. And this is part of the conversation where I'm hoping there's takeaways and I'm hoping there's questions from the audience, because the Q&A is really what always makes this exciting. So please participate if you have questions. There's microphones, so or raise your hand and I'll direct you to a microphone or something. But you fast forward, 2019. I've been with Rhino Security for about 5 years now, four and a half. In fact, I got my job 2 months after I was unbanned off the internet rather. After I was arrested, I was asked not to get on the internet. There were conditions of parole and all that craziness, and which gave me more time to think about what the hell it is I was doing and what my next steps are going to be. So, as a professional now, what are some of the issues that I'm seeing that I was exploiting back in the days? And I would have to say these are issues we've been facing for the last 30 years and we're going to face for the next 30 years. You have password management issues and password reuse, which is not going to change until we phase passwords out completely, okay? That's just the reality of the situation. The second thing is access controls, authorization, authentication. There's a lot of issues that we're dealing with. Bad implementations. I'll give you a great example. I'm very happy that organizations and banks are now using MFA or 2FA, but then they're relying on SMS. And SMS-based multi-factor authentication or secondary factor authentication is not the route to go, right? I'm sure you guys have read in the news, people doing SIM swaps, hijacking SIM cards, and then, at that point, your 2FA is useless. Then we have things like the human element. The human element is always going to be a problem in any organization, whether it's the military, a government, a company, a mom and pop shop, because people just want to help in general. And I know Verizon released several reports on their yearly incident report reports, where they mentioned that at least 4% of any given situation, or in any given situation, employees will click or open documents that are sent to them. Regardless of user training, regardless of all the education you want to put them to, plus the technical controls you put in place. So the human element is not going away ever, and it's always going to be there. So long as your employees have an email address or they have to interface with customers, they are going to be the #1 attack vector for any attacker, whether it's a scammer or a nation-state actor. It's going to be the same. Asset management is another problem. Asset management is another problem because, especially with legacy systems, organizations that they've been on the internet for 20 plus years, they may have a good budget, or maybe a college that hasn't had the funding to focus on inventorying every system, you have asset management problems always, compromising something, some elements of an organization. I'll give you some examples, because I love examples. Uber is a great example. Uber had a situation where the developers were posting API keys on GitHub. That was a really famous, incident, where it is another asset management situation, where you have developers posting content, sensitive content, passwords and keys to public repositories that they really should not be there. Then you have all these different organizations that have been compromised over the last few years due to bad S3 bucket or cloud-hosted storage objects that were, publicly accessible, and you can actually download dumps of databases or credit cards. And I mean, it's almost endless when you start looking at the breach incidents or the breach listings for some of this stuff. And then always, and this is one of the things that I really want to talk about, is that implementation is always going to be a big issue moving forward, right? So implementation, what I really mean by that, it's something that I love to talk about, is, well, let's say you have an organization, you have a lot of money, your budget is great. Okay, that's fantastic. You start calling all your vendors, you have a whole bunch of really cool tools. You have Black Carbon and CrowdStrike, you have EDRs of every other solution, you have a SIM service, you have everything that you need to technically secure your infrastructure. But most of the time, these are really just default installations of the tools. There's no manual configuration of certain things. There's no customization of rules that are needed. And so what ends up happening is you're basically driving around a really, really nice Beamer with a Honda Civic motor. You know what I mean? You have the tools, you just don't have the capabilities. And so implementation becomes important. And this works on both sides, on the offensive and the defensive. And I'm really talking about the defensive here, because I think a lot of you folks would probably relate more to the defense side. Now we're moving into the cloud. And cloud security, again, I was talking with the class earlier, a couple of the students here, talk about cloud security and how it's an entirely different beast, an entirely different monster. There are literally dozens of brand new services every other day, whether you're on AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure. And the documentation for some of these services are really, really verbose, very long-winded, like some of my answers here. But also, it's almost impossible for you to implement or bring in a new service from AWS and have your developers try to deploy the service within a couple of weeks, when in reality they're just going with the basic summary. They're not really reading through the documentation. They have no concept or no idea of the kind of threat modeling you have to do or the risk assessments you have to do there to understand what would happen if you enabled a certain permission for an object and what that would do and what that would lead to. So my job as the offender these days is to do exactly what I used to do as a black hat or as a gray hat, which is to assess the potential for breaking an application, right? Going back to the beginning, understanding the underlying technologies and infrastructures, then of course exploiting. Now the difference is that not only do I do it as a professional, but now I have to explain it in as layman terms as possible, so that everyone in the conversation understands what it is that is the issue, what it is that's the core issue, and what would be a core solution. So as we get to know near the end, I know that we want to do some Q&A, some questions, and I would definitely hope that you guys have questions. Please jump in. I don't know how you want to do this. April, you want to pass the mic around, or? Oh, cheers. Thank you, thank you.
So we have microphones. If you need a microphone in the back here.
Sure. Yeah, well, I guess until someone jumps up and asks a question, I guess I'll finalize here by saying that, I definitely had an interesting road. It was a road with mistakes. I've definitely made some bad decisions there. It was a very human story where I was able to, realize my mistakes and understand that, sometimes, it's just a matter of self-reflection and using consequential thinking to try to avoid some of the stuff I had to go through, right? And I'm also very fortunate and blessed that I've been given that second chance at life. At first I was kind of shocked by the whole experience of being arrested and all that. But I think that the best way I could summarize this before we get into questions is that I do not regret, the the path I had to take, I had to deal with that. I really appreciate the consequences. It really gave me some good perspective and insights. So please, I know you have a question?
Yes. The vectors that are used by the black hats. You have your emails vectors. You have your funny websites. What's the third major vector?
So emails and the funny websites. So that's mostly social engineering, right?
Correct.
But if you want to keep on that social engineering topic, the next thing would be documents, malicious payloads inside of documents, browser-based exploits, which are really big but are very expensive. So yeah, you could send a very nice-looking link to somebody, and there is a brand new zero-day Firefox exploit, but I guarantee you it's not going to be used by, a day-to-day script kiddie or scammer. You're more than likely targeted by a nation-state actor or an intelligence agency. And the reason for that, by the way, is because those exploits cost a lot of money. Those 0 days are literally, some of them are $1 million plus, depending, right? Now, to target people specifically, one major trend recently has been like breach databases. And so what you end up having is an attacker who has a database of, let's say, 1.8 billion breach credentials. They look up your name and family members, your emails, and they create a profile or maybe a target list of 18 different emails you've used over your lifetime, maybe your ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend, family members, mothers, and so on. They have a general list of passwords, and then they just spray the services, trying to find access to one of your accounts. That's something that's very common these days, especially if you are in social media, you have one of those OG social media names, you're going to deal with someone trying to password spray your accounts, hijack your accounts, and so on. So there's some ideas there. And definitely password management issues. I would say that's a core issue. I think you have a question, sir? The guy with the microphone, you. Oh, you're passing it around?
Well, I'll ask you one, but
Sure.
then I'll pass it around. So talk about the vulnerabilities we're seeing with the Internet of Things and where you think that's headed as far as the next breach with someone controlling an automated car or listening in through Alexa. What do you think about that?
Well, those are, look, that's a great question, but it's very contextual, right? So like if you're talking about like an IoT device coming from China, then you're gonna be talking about firmware issues, firmware vulnerabilities, default passwords and credentials, issues with the web servers if there are any, insecure communications from the IoT device to their central server, man-in-the-middle attacks, you name it. There's a whole bunch of different vulnerabilities. Now, when you talk about something like Alexa, listening in from Alexa, you would have to compromise either a local network and do some man-in-the-middle spoofing, ARP spoofing, or whatever it is you have to do, which I don't think is going to be realistic since Alexa is probably using HTTPS with HSTS security headers or similar. But to start listening in from an Alexa from the AWS point of view, you would have to compromise AWS. And just a food for thought, AWS has a major security team that have been doing this for a very long time. So if you're going to hack into AWS to compromise my Alexa or her Alexa or his Alexa, I think you went way beyond scope, right? So, but just like any other device, IoT devices are just any network connected devices. They are going to have vulnerabilities, and it all depends on how they're structured, right? So the best example I could give is for a while I was loving those like really cool, the color lights, the LED lights. You could change them in your room and put the party mode on, and you could rock some, whatever. And then until I started realizing that some of those were coming from China with backdoored or vulnerable firmware that would allow you or allow an attacker on your network to compromise a light bulb. Now, what can they do with the light bulb? I have no idea. But they more than likely will, realistically, use the light bulb to bounce around the internal network, use it as a proxy or something similar. Or maybe visit child porn and have the FBI raid your house. The point is, there's a whole bunch of different threat vectors when you're talking about those kind of IoT devices on your network, right? So, question?
Most corporate entities offer like anti-phishing training, and
Sure.
They kind of, when they onboard you, they put you through a suite of classes in education, and basically most major corporations offer that now these days.
Sure.
But obviously, they're still being infiltrated successfully, and for very long periods of time, you know, going undetected. And a lot of them are coming in through these phishing attacks. So,
That's right.
you know, in your experience, like, what are kind of 3 things organizations can do to improve the quality of the people education, you know, to kind of maybe prevent or at least, you know, mitigate to a higher degree of, you know, like the social engineering aspect of things, or, you know, the infiltration through phishing and kind of the easier low-hanging fruit mechanisms that are employed these days?
I mean, that is a great question. I'm going to add some additional stuff to that, right? So I'm also going to add the technical aspect of what I think needs to be done. As an offender, I'll tell you guys exactly how I'm getting into the system through social engineering, and it's as simple as possible, right? There requires some infrastructure on my end. But let's go with the training side of things first. The first thing is that you have to help your employees understand what social engineering is in general. There are some times when I even mention the term and people look at me blankly, like, what is that? Well, it's phishing, you know, or it's vishing, or it's the situation where people ask you for your password. You're not supposed to give them your password, but you do anyway. That's what that is, right? So, really having them understand what phishing is in general. The second thing is you want to make sure that they understand what a URL is. You want to make sure that they look at the URLs before they click on links, if possible. And if they accidentally click on a link and they end up on a landing page, to look for indicators of compromise, right? That's the way I like to put it. Look for items that are going to be dead giveaways. I'll give you several good examples here. One, let's go to the landing page. The URL is hoodcollege.edu.cam, right? So we want to make sure that they understand that TLD, that top-level domain at the end, the .cam, is not legitimate. And more than likely, that's really not a legit landing page. The second thing is you want to look for is HTTPS a thing? Like, is it enabled on the web server? Which doesn't mean nothing, because as an attacker, I'm setting up landing pages with valid HTTPS. Shout out to Let's Encrypt, right? You know, you want to make sure that they have a basic understanding of some of the things they need to look for. And the last thing is going to be context. Why is my CEO going to email me an Excel sheet? Right? Why is the secretary sending me a URL to update my password? Right? Why is somebody sending me a binary that is zip encrypted? Okay? These are the kind of IOCs and kind of things that you want to be able to share with your employees. And I would say every 3 months, every 6 months, do some sort of course. Fortunately, you have things like fish.ai and FishMe, and you know, some of them are pretty cheap. KnowBefore.com is another one. They're cheap. You know, you could definitely at least do some sort of course, replicate the concepts, and then do some training programs on the internal side. Technical side, I don't want to run out of time. Just bear with me, April, please. Technical side, here's what a defender could do to help against people like me. DNS categorization, awesome. What it means is, let's say on the internal side, you have a network like this one, and someone tries to go to a malicious landing page that has no DNS categorization, they're automatically blocked by the web proxy. Okay, boom. Now, why is that important? Because in most social engineering campaigns, the domains that they're using are less than 14 days old. Now, you have to ask yourself why. Because if you leave a landing page up online for, let's say, 2-3 months while you're doing an operation, eventually security researchers from Google, AWS, and who knows who else is going to find it and report it as a phishing landing page. All right, so DNS categorization is very important. You want to make sure that you set up a filter to block all brand new domains 14 days or less. You want to make sure that you use a service like Proofpoint or Mimecast, or you highly customize your spam assassin configuration to block domains that do not have valid DKIM signatures, that do not have valid SPF signatures, that do not have valid DMARC records. And in most cases, social engineers are lazy. They won't set any of that stuff up. So that's just some ideas. If you want more, feel free to add me to LinkedIn. I'll give you a whole bunch of different ideas. And we have a question.
Hi there. I am a proud Hood alum. And I'll share something with you as the historic point. My first email address was paula@uu.net.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things that I believe was historic and pioneered, and if not institutionalized the role of hackers, was Netscape. Netscape issued in 1995 a press release announcing a $1 million hacker bounty for the first hacker that could hack into their latest version of their web page. And so that was probably a tipping point for us at UUNet to figure out how to protect those systems. Now, no longer in the internet, I've got two colleagues here who are new into the cyberspace world, and they have a question for you as well.
All right.
Hey, Hector. Thank
Hey,
you.
Hector.
And I really like your emphasis on enabling the blue team because that's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
I mean, you look at the landscape today, right? You got preventative technologies out there that are using signature, heuristic-based, the old guys, McAfee, semantics. And then you guys have guys out there who are claiming mathematics, which I'm sure you know which company I'm talking about. And then you have EDRs, like you had mentioned, focused on detection and response. What do you think about the active phase? And then what do you think about the rise of AI and automation that's coming that are looking at threats in real time, right, as they're coming in? Whether it's through machine learning, through Bayesian or random forest. Would like your feedback on that. And also kind of where you see the industry like 3, 4, 5 years down the road as well.
Well, that's great. That's a beautiful question. So I love the proactive approach to security, and it would be nice. I mean, a big shout out to Symantec and McAfee, those old guys. Their products worked for a hot minute, and they'll catch like the Metasploit, script kiddies or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that every single day there's great research coming out using C# to create dynamic processes in the process list, and file list stagers, and all these different sorts of binaries that are really not detected because they don't carry a common signature for the most part, right? With the exception of like if you use Silent Trinity or Iron Python based malware, you're going to find that some of them will carry that Iron Python set of binaries. You may be able to identify the potential for that being a malicious event or whatever. But the truth is, you can't really necessarily rely on signatures. I'm really big on the machine learning aspect of it. I know Google is doing some really amazing stuff with it. In fact, like this week in San Francisco, they spent a long time talking at the GCP conference about machine learning and then focusing their efforts on security and malware detection and so on. That's beautiful. I'm big for sandboxing. I think that's really awesome. I think the first step we took was sandboxing several years ago, right? It's not a new technology, but that was the first technology that allowed us to isolate at least, the potential for, lateral movement or infection from a malicious document. That was the first good step. But even sandboxing technology has been defeated. So I'm looking forward to see what ML does. I'm looking to see what happens there, and I'm definitely for it. Now, I want to touch on what you said in the beginning about the blue teams. We definitely need an emphasis on blue teams. And I know my time is running out here, but his question actually leads me to one of my final points, which is that we do have a skill and talent shortage in this country. We have a problem where we don't have enough workers. I can guarantee you law enforcement could tell you the same thing. There's a lot of folks in law enforcement that, haven't, I would say that they're definitely missing some of the, cybersecurity training that they need. And this goes up all the way up to the FBI where they're on demand, right? The military is on demand. There's so many aspects of our, I would say, our total infrastructure and overall security posture that's not doing too well. If there was like a really serious cyber war, and I hate to use the term, trust me, believe me, I really do. If there was a critical attacks against our infrastructure en masse, we would probably have some serious problems. And I guarantee you, when you look at situations in Russia where they attacked both Estonia and Ukraine over the last several years, they shut down critical elements of their infrastructure as a proof of concept. So what you saw in Ukraine and what you saw in Estonia was just an example of what can be done to us. Now, is that something that is our security up to par or down to par as Estonians? I have no idea. I guess we'll find out when the time comes. But we do need the next generation of cybersecurity personnel. And that's why I've been looking at the students over here, right? Because, the industry is still in its infancy. It's still very young. And I can almost guarantee you, and I hate to throw numbers out, but if you're interested by money, what's going to end up happening is that if you guys start jumping into the industry now, the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to be making those 6 figures. You're going to be doing very well for yourself. All right? So instead of finding yourself in a path that's not really going to lead to where you want to be led to, I suggest, really, really investing in cybersecurity. And one last thing I'll say is, if you have any questions, sure. That's a great one, right? Yeah, I mean, it's probably the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, imagine all the other incidents that have not been found or have been kept quiet. This could be an incident happening right now where we're having this speech. There's someone plugging in USB sticks upstairs. It's kind of difficult to really gauge, how successful that operation was. Because for all we know, maybe that person was like a test dummy, right? Maybe while the Secret Service was focusing on that one USB drive, or USB stick rather, there were, a couple of other agents infecting other elements of their infrastructure. Or maybe they were at another Mar-a-Lago infecting their systems. So this is all about security posture and having awareness about what could happen and what could not happen, right? I mean, it falls hand in hand with physical security and terrorism, right? I don't want to make the association at all, please, no, but you have to look at cybersecurity kind of like how you look at physical security. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to add me on LinkedIn and ask all the questions you want. April?
Yep, thank you. Hector's not turning into a pumpkin at 8, but he does have a red eye to catch, so we're going to give him a final round of applause. He'll be here for another couple of minutes. Feel free to say hello. Thank you.
Thank you.